So we're back with another database. It's July. We've halfway through the year, believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, over halfway through the year. And already we've had quite an epic year of new technology, new noise, new distractions and all things going on. There's a whole FTC thing with Activision. I'm not a big fan. Don't really want to spend a lot of time talking about it. So I will do a video separately, a database on that, I think, overall as a subject on its own. So I'll park that one for now and we'll go into other areas. And obviously, one big area, the internet. The internet and many of the tech press, actually, were very unhappy with the AMD partnership announcement with Starfield last week. The level of outcry seemed almost like a PR push, if I'm being honest. What I read and heard online, at least. Anyway, but for the record, those that do not know, I'm not a fan of this at all. I've never agreed with paying to hold off features or content from a game on X platform for any reason at all, ever. Be that exclusive levels or gearing games for both PlayStation or Xbox and even Nintendo, or graphical features such as, anti-aliasing or smoke. Now, most software can run on most hardware, within reason, obviously, and that's why here with FSR2, it's one of Nvidia's own making. Well, at least partly, anyway. See, they're not really in a position here to take any moral high ground. They're in a glass house, the floor, the ceiling, everything. And all they've done time and time again is this kind of stuff. It might seem as minor as this. The smoke in Batman, the AA in Watch Dogs, the God Rays, for Pete's sake, in Far Cry 4. Not to mention some other questionable implementations of solutions designed to impact ATI or AMD cards, such as tessellation and even ray tracing. But as the saying goes, all's fair in love and war. And I was surprised also by everyone stating that Nvidia are happy to have FSR2 next to DLSS2 in games, which I largely agree with, they are. But only last year, remember, Plague's Tale launched with only DLSS2 and 3 and was a heavily marketed linked title with Nvidia, and it had no FSR2. It wasn't present then, or at least not in any visible form. I'm obviously talking about the patches that came later on. And yet, aside myself, I cannot even recall anyone in the tech press even raising an eyebrow, let alone an issue. And that brings me to my only real issue with it all: hypocrisy. We're all guilty of that from time to time. Nobody's exempt, but normally by mistake, or at least that's what you would expect. And if pointed out, reminded, most of us will then accept that and say, oh, yeah, do you know what? I forgot about that. You're right. Move on. But I've seen comments like, this is different, or that's different, or one game in X amount of games doesn't really add up to the same thing, which is double standards, let's be honest. So the morality piece out of the way that I disagree with, but in reality, I do not feel sorry for Nvidia. It's Nvidia's own making, and certainly I feel sorry for Nvidia RTX owners, myself included, that are impacted, which it's not really AMD's problem, recall, but they still provide a solution to it. And this brings me to what I said about FSR2 when I covered it on IGN at launch and later on my own channel, and presumed what would happen with 2 and then later FSR3, which will include frame reprojection, interpolation from inference. The one-size-fits-all approach will always win out in the end, and any proprietary solution has to be either exceptional and hopefully easier to implement for at least the hardware it's running on. And Nvidia's DLSS is not open source. You need to pay Nvidia a fee to use it and all of the caveats that go alongside that, or you sign a deal, etc. And then you get access to this, and they get access to your game engine, as they need to hook it into that to get required sample points such as motion vectors, color buffers, etc. I'm not sure if they still do this section of running it through their inference machine to basically give their AI cores time to learn, in quotes. But again, with AMD, you don't do any of this. You don't need to give your code over to them. You take their code, you adapt it, you update it, or you just drop it in and test it. So the big win here is many teams can build and, more importantly, test, refine, optimize the game's visuals, the performance and the quality across this single variable, or at least singular variable, certainly when it comes to Xbox consoles and PC. Now, I know the PC space will have more complexity here, but it brings me to my next point that, again, is not really discussed here. Taking the June 2023 Steam hardware survey across all DX12 capable GPUs, again, I'm not saying that this is absolutely 100% accurate, but it's a bloody good representation of the market. So let's be honest, Steam is at the lion's share. So this is a baseline level that everyone's at, and anyone playing games on PC likely has Steam installed. So taking that DX12 capable GPUs, we can see that Nvidia GPUs at least ones that support DLSS 2, so that's RTX 2000 upwards, is approximately 40% of the market, which is very impressive. And as we always say, Nvidia owns the market. And it's a big portion. And thus we can see that this will impact a big portion of that PC market. So I understand why so many people are upset about it. But we can also see that Nvidia has a further 34% of that DirectX 12 capable GPU market. So a total of 75% of the market. That's huge. And they are basically running Nvidia DX12 capable GPUs. So they can support DLSS 2 if the cards could run it. But only 40% of those can utilize DLSS, be that 1, 2, or 3. Actually 3, no, forget the 3, that's even smaller. Which is a bigger kick for Nvidia owners overall, as the list of DLSS capable games is well over 200 now, which leaves 34% of Nvidia owners high and dry. They can't use it. And you see, that is the point of gaining market share. You have to disrupt the market. And by offering an equivalent solution that relies on the same inputs and offers similar performance, it gains goodwill and mind share. So when you actually do come to upgrade, you remember that AMD offered you an extended lifespan on your GPU, and therefore you're likely to just look across at Team Red and Team Green and think, oh, do you know what? Actually, that didn't work out very well for me. I'll possibly jump ship. And that's all fair and good practice, and nothing wrong with that at all. Let's be clear. And also, to be clear, the DLSS is still the superior solution. It's qualitatively better from that perspective than FSR2. Absolutely. I've said that multiple times. I've covered that multiple times. But for the mainstream market, and certainly the mid-range green space that most majority of the market share sits within, the difference in price does not really come anywhere close to the difference in quality, which is why 8 out of 10 times the biggest factor in buying a GPU is cost. In addition to that Nvidia space though, AMD themselves have 8% of that same DX12 market, which is actually not that terrible considering, but it's certainly nowhere close to what Nvidia are doing. You can see how small AMD are in this market. And it also had a tiny increase of just under 1%, but most importantly, that was within the RX 6000 and up range, which is my point. They're trying to grow new GPUs and take people off of Nvidia and over to AMD. The market probably isn't growing that big, certainly in the PC space, in desktop PCs. It's probably not growing anywhere near the level it used to. Well, it isn't. It isn't growing anywhere near the level it used to. Mobile PCs is a bigger area now. So they're well aware that they're not really going to gain that bigger market from new players. It's obviously more about bringing older players or current players over to the Team Red. And this is exactly why they're doing it. And that's all fair. And again, all of that 8% can use FSR2, as can that 1.6% of Intel GPU powered machines as well. So most of them will be APU derived, I would assume anyway, but the ARC 750 and certainly the 770 range is one of the most impressive and impactful new GPUs ever launched, in my opinion. And certainly, in fact, when you look at the quality and how close they've got to the market, and in terms of ray tracing, they're ahead of AMD. So overall, in the total market, the impact that can either use DLSS, XESS, or FSR2, then 60% of that market cannot use DLSS2. That's pretty big, with only a smaller 40% being able to run the superior option, although XESS is very close, and even less of those can run DLSS 3. But 100% of that market can use AMD's FSR2, and also 100% of the console market, which is 0% can use DLSS 2, at least thus far. And this reinforces my point as to why FSR2 would be successful and why it would get integrated. It simply reduces cost, complexity, and it improves overall quality faster due to reducing architectural complexity across multiple engines. And as I said, big studios such as Bethesda should not really be affected by this, and it should be all part and parcel of their operating cost. And they really shouldn't need it either. But development is more about the triple constraints than anything else, and not so much about supporting a proprietary solution such as DLSS, no matter how good it is. So, do I think that AMD locking DLSS 2 away is a good thing if they are doing it? No, absolutely not. I also, as a technical delivery chap for nigh on 40 years now, also strive to maximise quality and utilisation myself all the time, all across those years. But it's also instilled me in those years the reality of real world delivery and not internet chatter. Compromises have to be made. Areas have to be balanced, mitigated. Solutions need to be viable, successful, and achievable. And in reality, FSR2 makes currently and will continue to make far more economic and architectural sense across many teams, the majority of them moving forward. And I'm sure FSR3 will also gain a good head of steam when it drops. Now, buying that support by blocking others is not a practice I agree with at all, if that's what AMD have done. And I agree, it looks bad on them. As Gamers Nexus, Tech Jesus himself got a no comment, really does highlight. But I will caveat this with, again, a business perspective. Marketing deals happen all the time. They're not new and they can be of a vast variety. And as I mentioned, often strategic partnerships are a big part of the industry, many industries. And here, AMD will have helped Bethesda from a technical and performance perspective, and this makes them a good fit. See the market breakdown above. But it's also a brand awareness deal, and if AMD have paid to get their technology into the game, and they have in some way, shape or form, again, strategic partnerships don't always mean money changes hands. There's other ways these things and deals can be worked out. Often there is. And possibly later on down the line, they decide to include this game with their GPU sales of the next range, then the last thing they will allow is any distraction from that connection. See, when PlayStation or Xbox announce games at their shows, they never mention that they're also coming to the competition if they're multi-platform. Just see Metal Gear Solid Delta or Star Wars Outcast, with time limits sometimes, and when even the publisher themselves can actually acknowledge if that game is coming to another platform beyond a certain date. So this isn't new, and this isn't even recent. The game here is to convince the audience that this is the only available option and platform you can get it on. Basically, ask me no questions, I'll tell you no lies. But I would not be shocked to see if the game ships with DLSS 2 support, or it possibly comes in a later patch after launch. After all, they're in the market to sell their products, and that's exactly what a strategic partnership is all about. Now, see Requiem, DLSS 3, and Cyberpunk RT Overdrive and DLSS 3. You could still run those games on AMD cards, or admittedly, you couldn't run DLSS 3, but you can still run the ray tracing path trace option on AMD cards. It just runs terribly. Again, see my point around artificially making it run worse, or at least it's designed around that hardware. It's proprietary, so therefore it runs best on Nvidia, which is fair enough. So if it does in the end transpire that DLSS 2 is in the game at all, then that means that the people that cried wolf this time round need to note that in their diaries if the reverse should ever happen in the future. Now, I'm not that concerned about the later option of these deals, which is basically you can tie up a contract with a publisher or a developer to say, don't talk about this being on our rivals or this technology being on our rivals until around launch. That's fine in my opinion, it's marketing. Pre-ordering is only really a profit and loss accounting practice anyway. It doesn't really help any consumer to pre-order anything. Just wait for reviews if you can. But if this turns out to be the former, i.e. they have paid to block DLSS 3, then that is bad, and I don't want that to continue. And let's hope that it doesn't start an API war in the PC space, because that would be an absolute minefield. And it really helps no one at all, least of which all the top 3 manufacturers in that space. Anyway, that's what I think, that's my opinions. What do you think? Obviously, leave your thoughts and comments down below. Okay, moving on. Next one I've got on my list is the Xbox price hikes. Yeah, Xbox joined the gang. So this is perfectly normal. As I said, the same thing for Sony, I'll say here. Inflation, currency exchange rates are all a big reason. And as normal, the US is not impacted. But whereas Sony have likely kept themselves within a small profit per unit, helped by direct sales, as we saw with the PSVR 2, that does take out some of that margin. You know, it could be, I don't know what the margins are with retail now, but probably somewhere around 5, maybe 10% in certain places. That's obviously goes back to the supplier at that point, or the manufacturer at this point. So that's definitely an area Sony have worked hard on, and Xbox, I think, do direct sales as well. Plus, Sony are far more experienced in making mass market consumer electronics, which means they're likely far more efficient at doing that for the PlayStation 5 in terms of the BOM rate per unit than Microsoft is for the Series X, which explains why the Series S actually exists, as that's far more efficient in terms of its BOM cost to its retail cost. But even then, the new SKU Microsoft announced for that at this show recently is even more expensive by, I think, £50 or dollars for a further half a gig of more storage. So in reality, that's actually a replaced SKU for the S, and it's actually a small bump in price. They're actually hiding the price hike there, in my opinion, because they're probably saving money on the APU and the hardware inside the box, because that's all the same, and it's now 2 years older hardware, so therefore it's likely to be cheaper, potentially even on a smaller node. Therefore, you're getting more out of the same wafer, and yada yada yada. I say this thing to death. So it's a smaller margin for Microsoft on that model. So they're likely bumping twice on that SKU. They're making a little bit more on the unit itself, and they're bumping an extra 50 quid on the extra gigabyte of space they've got there, or the 1 gigabyte storage space they've got on the box itself, which again will help, because 512 gigs is a nightmare for me. Whenever I'm doing any reviews, I constantly have to copy stuff back and forth, and I will not buy one of those Seagate drives that cost a fortune. So that's just me. I go old school and use an old hard drive and copy them back and forth, and that works for me. It's fine. It's a pain. There you go. Now, overall, though, as I've said before with the PS5 price hike, this is not overly common. Absolutely, it's not. But it's not unknown for devices to become more expensive after launch. Again, I said this before, the Atari ST, back when I was a teenager, that cost of that actually went up after I bought mine, because the RAM cost across the world went up, the cost of RAM chips. And that was 512, megabytes of RAM. So that made a big difference. And actually, the Xbox 360 here in the UK, that actually went up. I think it was 2010 that went up, I believe. The arcade pack. The arcade pack went up at the time. They had quite a few packs at the time with 360. There was loads of them, the SKUs galore. I think they bumped up like 30 quid on that. So that was an even bigger price hike, in terms of inflation to then to now. £30 back in 2010 to now. Oh, probably about the same, really, 50 quid, probably give or take. So pound for pound, dollar for dollar. The exchange rates, again, were the reason for that. And as I've noted, most consumer electronic prices do go up over time, but game consoles and PCs tend to be more volatile to price hikes than, say, TVs or phones or hi-fis and DVD players and stuff like that. All that kind of stuff was regularly fluctuated. And on top of this, the other part is they've also raised the price of Xbox Game Pass. And again, that's happened multiple times now. And I always say this happens with subscriptions or GAS or SaaS services. What they do is they start off at, here's one single solution, please buy it. Sony did the same with PS Plus and their multiple tiers. That's just the way it goes. And then you break it into smaller parts, and then you add those tier levels in, and then you increase those over time, and then it all brings me back to the old days of operating system costs. And I was around at the very beginning when Windows 3.1 and upwards was coming out, and you got to a point with operating system costs that if you couldn't afford to not buy an OEM linked hardware, and sometimes it was actually cheaper for me, I personally did this, to buy a CPU and sell it to get the key than it was to go and buy a licensed product, because it was just such a pain in the bum. And now you can pick up Windows keys for like 10 quid or £30 or dollars or whatever. So Game Pass is good value for those that just like to browse a selection of games, and older, bigger ones that land, months after or years after it comes out. And obviously for Xbox directly, you can get some of those big first-party titles, although it's been quite stagnant in the last couple of years, so you haven't really got massive amounts out of that value at this point. But now they're bumping the price up just as stuff starts coming out. So, again, you're seeing the connection here that we always say. And not just me, others say the same thing as well. This is kind of a known entity. It's not as if I'm announcing something that's completely cloak and dagger. It's out there in the market. Just look around, you can see it. It is what it is. It's not really a shock at all. And like I say, the market, the price of these chips, the parts, it's all getting relatively more expensive. Things aren't getting cheaper across the world, and we're seeing price hikes and the specs being balanced more across consoles and hardware. And in many ways, this is the first time in the past 15 years that I can remember that early adopters are actually getting the better deal on the hardware. So if you bought a PS5 and a Series X like I did at launch, then actually you're getting a better deal, because you've had all this time with it and you're still paying less than people who buy it brand new now. So, okay, that's again, this is a good example of where the market's changing. And when always people say early adopters, beta testing and all that, 9 times out of 10 it's been true, but here we're already seeing that that's not true. You're actually getting a better deal if you buy early. So be aware of that and just see how this market shakes out. Obviously, unless of course you're in the US, where you just get left. You guys are so lucky, man. Australia and Canada, parts of Europe, they get it even worse than we do in the UK. So yeah, it's not exactly plain sailing everywhere, but we're not seeing realistic levels of VRAM in GPUs of late. And that kind of brings me to my next point, which is actually, looking at my list, yeah, they're all connected, actually. Apparently that's what I did when I wrote this down originally. So yeah, the Xbox parity clause and Baldur's Gate 3. So I know this was announced quite a while ago. They put the game out, they announced it, 4K 60 FPS on PS5. It'll be the same on Series X, absolutely. The Series S is really, going back to the Game Pass for a minute, that's what it is. Series S was a Game Pass device. That was always its point. That was the only reason it was invented. It makes sense. And I'm sure that little box has really helped push Microsoft numbers, which actually were just revealed. 21 million, I think it was, combined, thanks to the incredibly efficient and successful redaction process they had going on there.
What year is it?
It was brand new.
No. What year is it?
1995, remember?
Along with many other things that I'll cover later in another video, but the relevant part here is the success of the Series S on overall current-gen consoles in homes means Xbox needs to enforce parity at a level. Otherwise, they risk bigger issues with that plan, their plan, in terms of getting that into the homes, getting Game Pass into homes, and that's the solution they're using for little, Tilly and Tommy. Like most things in that FTC area, though, the team over at IGN have done a superb job in keeping all of the information and news up to date. Please do go check them out on there in terms of all the stuff they've put up there, both videos and articles, because it's really helped me. I've definitely jumped on and used it as well. There's a link down below for what I'm looking at. But the team over at IGN basically posted lots and lots of updates, and they did one here on Baldur's Gate around the technical issues from Xbox. And so the long and short of it is what I covered in my original preview of the Series S before it was announced. And in many ways, my coverage since then has kind of reinforced that. Microsoft cut back in the obvious areas, very impactful areas, a little bit too much, namely the memory both in bandwidth and space. If you recall, I expected them to go somewhere between a 192 or a 128-bit bandwidth and then split that up. I thought it might be 6 gig for the game, 4 gig for the operating system. Wasn't quite sure where the split was, probably a bit of dynamic adjustment. So roughly what they get is they get 8 gigabyte for the entire game, which is too small. Remember, that's used for GPU and CPU, and then it's shared on the same bus, which adds even more contention. So you've only got a 128-bit bus with a 228 gigabytes per second bandwidth, which is, it's not a lot. It really is not. Sorry, 224 gigabytes of bandwidth. Apologies, 224. 128-bit, 224 gigabytes of bandwidth. But more importantly, on the operating system side, you've only got 56 gigabytes. And that's simply because really what you've got is you've got 32-bit buses across multiple nodes, as you see here with my original video. And I'm just going to overlay some updated stuff. So what you've got is these two split pools means that if you bleed out of that 8 gig, you bleed into that 2 gig. And that's probably got a reserve. There's probably a level there. That 2 gig isn't fully dedicated to the operating system. It's probably reserved and it takes priority and all that. But there's probably an allocation there in case you need it. You can bleed over. It's probably not much, maybe 512 meg, maybe a gig. I don't know. But there's more than likely a standard practice, and programmers are always going to do that, but that's what we do. Literally 4 kilobytes, you take it because you need it. So if there's going to be a 512 meg kicking around or more, you're going to just reach out and grab it. So with a game that's pushing technology, you're going to be desperate for more RAM. But when you've got this split pools, and when you've got 2 pools and you're dipping in and out of both of them, you're going to get contention, because in a system like a console, it's console's biggest weakness. PC's biggest weakness is the fact that it's got split pools. So it's got dedicated GPU VRAM and therefore the PCI Express, and it's got dedicated system RAM, very different memory structures, very different latency times and all of that. I've covered that before in many of my videos. So that's the benefit of PC, as well as its biggest weakness, because that means that when things are working, and if you balance it correctly and you work to that strength, you don't get contention because you've got 2 dedicated systems working independently, albeit with the cost of copying. So like everything's compromised, everything's compromised. With consoles, it's the other way around. You've constantly got to battle contention. You've constantly got to battle a singular pool of RAM. So you've got data race issues. I'm not going to go into all that here, but effectively you've got all these issues. But the biggest one here is contention. So I'm trying to do something as a GPU, and you, the CPU, are trying to do something at the same time. We're both trying to drive down the same road. 2 things can't occupy the same space. So one of us has got to wait. That creates issues. Compounding that is the fact they've only got 8 gig. So they've got to then bleed into another space. If you're then dropping down to a 32-bit bandwidth, so 56 gigabytes per second, that's going to kill. any kind of performance levels, and potentially going to create you lots of data race issues because you've then got to balance that out. Again, you're only as fast as your slowest part. So I'm sure that's a factor in what their problems are. I haven't said this, I'm surmising, but these are the areas where they are. And there's nothing new here. I've already said a million times about the memory issues, and it was far lower than I thought. So it's likely the same reason that Microsoft actually dropped the split screen in Halo Infinite. But as I covered back then, it's still actually in the game, and it actually worked quite well, even on Xbox One consoles. And that's why it worked. Because that was a last generation game, it's a cross generation game, and we're very, very firmly out of that period now, and we're into current generation. And in reality, the Series S is just below last generation consoles, in the Xbox One X at least, and in more ways than it's ahead. And I know I say this a lot in my reviews, but I want to reinforce it because it's a very big deal, and this is the first time we're seeing it publicly, and it's not going to be the last time, trust me. The Microsoft, was it ATG group? So everyone's got their own internal teams. They've gone in to try and help optimize the game for the Series S. Note, this also happened for the Matrix demo on Unreal Engine 5, and Unreal Engine 5 is going to be ubiquitous in this generation. So you're going to see a lot of that again on those titles, and the Series S is really going to suffer. And that's probably why you're seeing a lot of people behind the scenes. I've spoken to developers. They've said the same thing, but they're not allowed to come out and say it. And it's quite interesting that this is getting quite a lot of public airing, in so to speak, in terms of Baldur's Gate. So all the work that Microsoft were doing in there is about reducing those contention issues and saving on space. Maybe they should go and speak to the old Atari VCS or any of the 8-bit guys that used to take some tips from them on reducing space, because I'll tell you what, some of the stuff they did on the space they had is just bonkers when you think about it. But that joke aside, the issue here is on a serious one for Microsoft. Developers are really, coming up against a brick wall when it comes to Series S, and may also explain why we've seen some of those cross-generation games only launch on PlayStation 4 and Pro and not on Xbox One and Xbox One X, because this parity clause that Microsoft are enforcing on developers, i.e. you reach the level we want, otherwise you don't launch on our console at all. That's kind of a double-edged sword, and they could end up getting very cut on that, death by 1,000 cuts and all that. You get a lot of teams deciding not to release on Xbox, and people will say it's all exclusivity deals, but it might not be. It might be the fact that they're just thinking there's too much effort. And that's the thing that I need to reinforce. Again, I keep saying the same thing, but when it comes to developing, it's all about the effort, the skill, and ultimately the cost that all studios have to put in on shipping a game. It's a finite level. You've got a projected roadmap of delivery, you've got a timescale, you've got a budget, you've got resources, you've got all those things lined up. And if you start adding additional optimization complexity just to get the game run, and remember, this is a key gameplay function. This is not about graphics. Xbox are happy to have graphics cut back on the Series S because obviously they've got to be. But this is about the fact that they can't get split screen working because there's a lot more complexity there. And it really is the fact that they're cutting that feature really highlights that the weakness of the Series S is damning. And the effort and PR release here really shows that the team are getting frustrated. Baldur's Gate overall, the games have always been incredibly impressive and technically quite groundbreaking. So I'm not surprised that this is an issue that this team has run into. Recall, the Series S has roughly the same specifications as the PS4 Pro, but could actually end up having worse memory bus contention issues than that console does, because the PS4 has a split bus construction, which is why that console had that design, the onion and garlic stuff. I covered that way back with the PS4 and Xbox One's launch. The Series X also has a similar split pools of RAM and 2 buses, which helps mitigate these issues. Long and short, the PS5 and the Series X have approximately 68% more RAM than the Series S. And although it's not known on the PS5's internal bus construction, it's likely to have an improved design as that PS4 design with split buses, and they are absolutely managing contention. I know they are, but there's some things that I've been told that I can't say, but there's definitely things that I know they're doing, but I don't know the ins and outs of the architecture at all. So there's no new news here. But as I have been saying this since the specs were announced on the Series S, this is the reason why we haven't seen ray tracing more often than not, and sometimes no 60 FPS option. It's the CPU is more than good enough, and in fact the balance is wrong. Again, this is all bringing back to one of my main points. You have to balance a machine out. And in some ways, the Series S is CPU overloaded. Its CPU is faster than it can deal with because its GPU is under functioning a lot of the time because it's too small. It's 3 times less power than the Series X but its bandwidth and its construction and allocation of VRAM hamstrung it even more. So it really does have a CPU that's probably tying itself in knots sometimes, waiting around for other areas of the game, specifically around memory and bandwidth. So this issue is really only going to grow. And the recently announced Series X spec bump that we've just seen only has a bigger SSD. So that issue is not going to fix the devs' issue at all. And they can't upgrade the console because then that creates another market split, which is an even bigger issue for Microsoft. So that's not an option either. So I do generally feel sorry for the team at Baldur's Gate that they've kind of got caught up in this crossfire. It's not getting a lot of press overall, and big thumbs up to IGN for covering it, because I'd actually forgotten about it myself. It wasn't only because I was browsing the channel. So do go and check out IGN stuff. They've got a lot of stuff on there on FTC as well. It's actually quite interesting. So fair play to them, and obviously I'll be interested to see what it looks like when the game comes out later this year, and hopefully the Series X gets a release at launch at the very least. But, you know, watch this ever-shrinking space, I assume. Next one. New GPUs, back to PC and new GPUs. Yeah, so we had the latest release, was it last week? I think it was. Yeah, the RTX 4060 now on the back of the terrible RTX 4060 Ti. And, yeah, it's just another example of how the GPU market is really falling. And I believe the RTX 4000 series is actually the worst range of Nvidia GPUs in terms of sales since their first Dragoon-inspired origins of the 90s. The review kind of showed that it's a step back from that Ti. It's got lower bandwidth, which is not fixed by the cache increase. They've bumped it up. It's just too small. And overall, you need the games to support it. So that cache bandwidth is likely to improve further in the generation. So when people say things age like fine wine, the bump up, is it 4 times, 8 times? I'll have to check. I can't remember. I'll check and I'll put it on the screen. It's got a cache increase that will probably benefit later titles more than what we're seeing now. But generally, it's not going to make a huge amount of difference because it doesn't compensate for the fact that it's got such a small bandwidth compared to the previous and cheaper 3060. But it's also got a smaller die. So that's lacking compute overall, which is trying to bump up with clock speeds. But then most damning of all is it's got 8 gigabytes of VRAM, which the 3060 is cheaper, performs better the same, and actually has better bandwidth, which means more performance, better higher resolution, because it's got 50% more VRAM. So it means you can bump up resolution and texture quality when you're not bound by, ALU. Bandwidth, but if you are bandwidth bound, you're going to hit that quicker on the 4060 than you are on the 3060. So I get the reason, and nothing's changed here. It's cost, it's everything to do that's ever been, nothing new under the sun. Nvidia have been doing this since the TNT2 brand with the TNT M64 over the full 128-bit bus of the Pro TNT. But the same reasons there, the same impact, the same naming conventions, the confusion around it all. Here's a new 4060 that's actually worse than your previous 3060. That's mad. And that's bad. That's not. I'm going to borderline say it's not anti-consumer, but it's close to. It's dishonest, because the very obvious assumption that any person should make when they're buying a new product is this is a new product in that same range as the old one, therefore it must be better. And it's not. It's not. So they're not alone in doing this, of course. Let's be clear, but they are the leaders. And they simply are not offering good value, let alone good value in the market or against themselves or the competition. The latest RX 7600 from AMD is really got the same issue. It's only got 8 gigs of VRAM, but it is approximately £50 or so cheaper. Offers around the same performance, certainly rasterization games. And rasterization games are still the majority of the market. But for an extra 30 or 40 quid, you can buy a 6700 XT, which has got 50% more RAM, 30% or so better performance, and therefore overall high quality. And even Nvidia's own 3060 is arguably better, as I said. So unless you've got a very old GTX 10 or a 970 or a 750 Ti or a Radeon 400 or 500 range, then this card makes no sense. Even then, the value is kind of really bad. The proposition here, the value proposition and the legs it offers is terrible, which is kind of where my point is on these cards, and certainly this one, but anything else that's coming out at the moment. 8 gigabytes is simply not enough. I've been saying it for years. 12 gigabyte might just suffice, but 16 gigabyte is where you really need to be to match the PS5 levels in games. And anything lower than that is going to impact quality and performance. And as I've been showing you and said this would happen this generation, it's going to get consistently worse. And at the moment, unless you're desperate to upgrade or get into PC gaming, you should buy an older, cheaper card to see how the market fares, such as the RX 580 actually I covered a few months back for like £130, or wait for prices to continue to drop and see what the new ranges are next year or beyond, and then see what the prices they come into and what discounts are put on the current range. Again, the growing push for AI everywhere, aka create a demand that you yourself can then fill, then this may end up being the next cryptocurrency impact. So there's no 100% guarantee that it won't affect prices in the future, because remember, companies, naming no names, will use these kind of market influences to drive up demand for their units and therefore price. And they're having a terrible year at the moment. The stock's not doing great. They've lost, I mean, the cryptocurrency bomb, what was that? 44% sequential reduction year on year, 22, 20, 21, 22. So that's a big decrease. Don't get me wrong. They're all right. They're fine. They're not struggling with cash. They're a massive company. But it is an area where they've definitely lost money. So you can see why they'd want to push AI. And with all the stuff to do with cars, it's an area, a growth area that they can certainly get into. So all that aside, Nvidia and AMD have really not offered any compelling boosts over the previous generation. And aside Intel, who I think at the moment are absolutely doing an incredible job. Their first generation was superb, and they could make a huge leap next time. So that's the other thing to say. It's just, don't take your eye off Team Blue, because Intel could shock with the successor to the Arc 770, and they're working on it. It's done enough. It's all around whether or not that's actually, they've got the commitment to stay in the market, because they could steal a lot of the market if they come back with a unit that's price effective, has 16 gigabytes of VRAM, runs ray tracing similar, and an XeSS solution similar or better potentially than Nvidia. That is a disruptor, and I'll be very happy to see that, because that's the competition, and then everyone has to compete, and then we all win. That's the point of competition. If one person owns the market, you get Nvidia. So yeah, overall, all of that aside, AMD and Nvidia, they're not really moving up the game in terms of their previous generations, and really the reliance on them and everyone at the moment is software solutions to fill the gaps, aka DLSS, FSR. Except if this is going to be the deciding factor moving forward, and then that becomes a new battleground, then all bets are off, because then it becomes around who do you hire, what teams do you get in, and AMD are doing that. You can see that with AMD's hires. They're recently pulling in a lot more technical, software-driven people to help them in that area, because that's where you benefit the most. Hardware, it's the chicken and egg. You need good hardware to run good software, but you need good software to run on good hardware. So which comes first? You need both. The reality, you can't just do one. You need both. AMD's hardware is good enough. It's more than good enough to compete with Nvidia. It's not the hardware where they're losing. It's the software. They don't have the teams, the resources, the R&D investment that Nvidia do. Intel do, and that's why Intel made such a massive leap. AMD are learning, but they need to learn quicker. Their CPU is dominant, and in my space, they are really taking over in terms of AMD CPUs across data centers. But when it comes to GPUs, they're still not winning out. And it's a market that's growing both at home, but obviously in the business sector as well. With AI growing, people are using them more and more. They're using them for data farms and things like that. So it's not as if it's a market that won't make them money both in retail and consumer, but also business. So it's good to see that they're doing that, but they need to push much harder. So I'm looking forward to FSR 3. But overall, the new battleground in terms of AI frames, it's coming, people, I'm afraid. AI frames to partner our AI pixels.
For a very long time, haven't I, Cal?
Yes. Don't worry.
Okay, one more, a brief one, nostalgia. I kind of want to add a little bit of fun to these. I feel like it's been quite negative, so I like to be positive and fun. So this one I'm going to do, kind of backing up what I did at the beginning of the year when I did my top 10 games, or top 7 games, whatever it was. I kind of do this nostalgic thing. I've been playing games since the 70s, so it's kind of a thing that's all part and parcel of my life, along with many other things. So I want to do this thing of looking back. So on here, I'll try and do this day, this month, this year, 40 years ago, or whatever. So on this month, 40 years ago, Spectrum actually had a price cut. £55, which is huge. They took £55 off the Spectrum against its competitors. Because remember, at that time, when I was a kid going into the shops, just coming up to teenage years, the war of the home micros at the time was huge. And the least of which of their biggest competitors was clearly the Commodore 64. And this meant that the 16K and 48K Speccy was cheaper than the brilliant but really aging very fast VIC-20. And I had a VIC-20. I loved that machine. I thought it was great. But it was considerably cheaper than the Commodore 64 at the time. In fact, over 2 times cheaper. I think that was $349.99 at the time it launched. We couldn't afford 182. So it was basically 83 where I got my Commodore 64 because they were just too expensive. And they cut their price. But 349 Great British pounds back then. What's that, about £600-700 in today's age? Just gives you an idea of the value you're getting on hardware now. But anyway, the sub £100 price drop on that big Speccy, just it was £99.99p for the 16K one. You can see old adverts here from some of my old magazines and stuff, papers. Dixon's, the king of the high street back in the UK. You British people remember Dixon's. I used to love going in there. I used to work for them for a bit, actually. The price drop on the Spectrum hit mid-year, and it really came at the right time because it was when the market started to flood with the 8-bit era that we all know and love in terms of just if you were in the middle of that, it was just amazing because you had all these games coming out and you could go into like WH Smith and Woolworths and Boots. They were the big brands, and then you started getting them in like corner shops and petrol stations. They were everywhere, and it was just such a good market. And literally though, it was bedroom coding. It was people starting businesses from their homes. I was doing mail order stuff. I used to sell and do games, videos, records. We used to post them out, get jiffy bags, £5, advertising magazines. It was everywhere. It was rife. Anyway, but I digress. So back then, 40 years ago, they cut the price, and that was kind of when Manic Miner, which anyone remembers that game, was brilliant. Arguably, actually, the single biggest release at that time for the modern platforms in terms of what it did, because it was kind of the origins to the modern platformer. I know the sequel, Jet Set Willy, is really the better one because that's kind of fully free roaming. You can go flip screen and stuff, but none of the games we know of probably would not have existed if it wasn't for this classic. I wasn't saying it's the only one, but it was very, very influential, I think, across certainly in the UK, and a lot of other developers looked at that game, or programmers looked at that game and were like astounded by it, and certainly Jet Set Willy, it was amazing. And all the games that came out similar time. So this was the exact same year that Nintendo's Mario Brothers Arcade came out, which was building on the back of Donkey Kong. And of course, both of them really were inspired by Atari's Miner 2049er, which was released a few months prior in 82. And that was actually in my video at Christmas because that was on the classics, Atari 50 classics. If you haven't played that or you haven't bought it, buy it. It's amazing. And it really was this was the year that the micro war really kicked off. I know people look back in history and they talk about things when they came out, and it's not about, if you were there, you know that didn't matter. People about 82 in Spectrum, it wasn't really that big a thing. It was starting to, you could buy it, but it was 83 when it all started to blow up and things started to get very competitive. And by Christmas of actually this year, so Christmas was 83, which is just before just after we got our Commodore 64. Commodore reacted and they dropped the price as well. So it was a price war, which doesn't happen now. I used to miss those days. And this was the actual advert in the High Street Electrics King of Dixon's, as I say. This is the one that got me and my mum, I remember this vividly. We used to get up, she came in and she said, I've got my Club 24 card. So we went and put it on the Never Never. Well, I didn't, but my mum did. Splashed out some money on a Commodore 64. I think it was this actual pack, so £250. Because remember, it was like £349. I didn't even get you a data set. It just got you the console with a manual, and that was it. So the computer with a manual, and then you had to go and kind of either write your own coding, which was rife at the time in your magazines, but mostly it wasn't until now that deals became viable that you would go in and buy it and get maybe a couple of games with it as well. So we went there and got a game and this, I can't remember what the game was. It was a rubbish one, I think it was. And she also bought a very own TV, because back then, a lot of us rented TVs because just weren't rich enough to buy your own TV. We weren't quite rich enough to buy a VHS or Betamax player at the time, but we still had to go home and use the old wired remote control. Everyone remember those? Sitting on the floor with your wired remote control coming out the back of your VHS player. Press the button to stop, and in the end you got fed up with it and just tripped over it, or just walked over to the thing and pressed the top loader yourself. It'd actually be a few months later before we could afford a video player. We paid a few months off on the Never Never, and then thought, you know what, let's go and splash some more money that will cost us absolute fortune in interest rates. But the C64 was the only thing that mattered to me. I really loved that machine, and I had a ZX81, sorry, at the time, and it got pushed aside very quickly. And I loved my ZX81. I thought it was amazing. Played loads of games with it. Me and my mates used to come back from school and we'd play on that all the time. But the 64 took over my life. And Forbidden Forest, I vividly remember playing this game in '83 when we got it. So it was getting close to the end of the year. That's the thing, when people talk about things like they've got crystal memory, but everything's very vague back then. You'll think, oh, it was January, and then you know somebody tells you, or you see a photo and you think, oh, I didn't realise it was November. Nothing's crystal clear like that. So I definitely played it, I think August, September-ish time. It was definitely before Christmas anyway, and the game scared the bejesus out of me, but I love this game. Such a creepy, scary game in terms of the panic it induced, almost like an original Resident Evil, because it really made you like react quickly when the spiders or creatures come at you. You have to quickly turn, load your arrow up and fire. It was very, very hard, but such a good game, great sound, and I loved it. It was a great game. And the C64 really kind of sucked me in, because I got into programming on it, originally basic like everyone else, and then you get magazine listings, and then you could really go full on core and do assembly on it. And you even got applications back then where you could actually write in basic to assemble into ASM code and run that on the box as well. So there's so many great things about the C64. Write music for the SID chip was incredible, but obviously listening to it was better because people who are talented to write stuff. But that was it. It kind of 40 years ago, this very month, the 8-bit market really started. So if you're old enough to remember, yeah, you go, 40 years. How old do you feel now? I know I do, Jesus. So yeah, 40 years ago, the Spectrum and the Commodore 64 battle began. Amazing times.
He's been hunted in the arcades, but he's escaped. Now Hunchback has jumped into home computers. Ocean's fabulous new Hunchback brings you the authentic arcade action. Jump over knights, swing over the fiery pit, outfox fireballs, dodge arrows, rescue Esmeralda, and it's the hairiest, scariest video game in 400 years. Hunchback from Ocean, just one of a top-selling range of game programs on cassette for most popular micros.
Okay, so what we got next? We got questions. We got Q&A questions. So thank you everyone for sending questions in. I do appreciate it. It's very, very helpful. I'm glad I can add some value, hopefully. So if you have or are a supporter, please post your questions over on Patreon and I will put them into the next video. If you're not, you can always join and help me out. Any pounds or dollars really helps. Post a question about anything that I think I can answer, and I will, or try my best to. And I really appreciate all the support, so thank each and every one of you that have supported me. Thank you very much. I do generally appreciate it, and apologies for my tardiness over the past couple of weeks, just personal situations. Anyway, Jedi Mind Trick. Jedi Mind Trick. For your next database, if it's worthy of being included, of course it's worthy, Jedi. Of course it's worthy. I was wondering if you could explain what physically based rendering is, and I've heard you refer to it before, most recently in your Spider-Man 2 preview video, but not quite what it means or what an example of a non PBR would look like. Thank you. Okay, so great question. Always good to ask questions, and obviously also help me understand that the nomenclature that I use and many of us use kind of isn't always known. So I do try and always correct that, but it's good to have. So hopefully this will help. I'm going to caveat this with, I don't believe in experts. No experts exist. But if there's somebody in the comments down below that is a lighting artist and a professional in this area, please be happy to jump in and correct anything I'm about to say. But overall, my experience is around playing with engines, first-hand experience, understanding lighting and film and all that stuff. And obviously just having a very strong passion for all these kind of things and getting involved. So, you know, I've hands-on experience, written lots of areas in terms of education, but also read a lot. So fundamentally, the most important aspect of anything in light, in terms of how we see, is light. So light is very important, but objects don't react to light in the same way. So in the real world, everything is an approximation of what the real world does. It doesn't matter what you've seen. Best game, best film in the world you've ever seen. It's not accurate. It's proximate. Everything's approximate because it's just too expensive. Light's infinite, so light bounces infinitely, and you can never emulate it in real world, even with the best path trace in the world, because you just run out of computational time to render it. But really, you can approximate it to a level, and it gets very good. And we hit that level really at the PS4, Xbox One era, when that really became standard. In my opinion, the best one that's out there, and I think arguably it is the best one that kicked off the generation, was the Order 1886 from Ready at Dawn. They really hit the benchmark, which has been hard to beat, and I don't think we'll see a leap like that again in terms of the previous generation. I also think Crytek did an amazing job with Rise, and I think that's a beautiful looking game on the Xbox One, and that was very, very close. I think it was one of the best. Those two games stand out to me in terms of the generation kickoffs that really made that generation look different from the previous. There were other games that did the same thing. So there was Don't Nod and Remember Me. That was an incredible looking game on the PS3. I think it was on 360, I'll have to check. But that looked great. I covered that a while ago on my channel. And that was using PBR-based material. So what is PBR? What is physically based rendering? So surfaces have multiple facets of what they do and how they work. So if you think of skin, skin's got multiple layers, epidermis, dermis, and then the hypodermis. So that's where the blood and fat is. Light will hit your skin. It will penetrate little surfaces because your skin's very uneven, what's called microfacets. So it's very rough. And light will go into it, bounce around within it, and then bounce back out of it, which is why you get what's called subsurface scattering. So that's one area of what PBR materials try to recreate. And you'll see this in older games where skin looks like everyone looks dead, like they've been embalmed, or they look really pink and glowy. There's never anything in between. But you look at modern games, and again, I'm using the Order 1886 here because it's one of the best examples you could see. If you jump between an older game and the Order 1886, look at the skin. Look at how reactive the skin is. Look at the hair. Look at the eyes, the parallax, the specular, the Fresnel on his hair. Fresnel is edge lighting. So it comes from Fresnel is his name, the guy that invented it, which is lighting on the studio lights. It's where light hits an edge and it kind of bounces around that edge and curves over the surface. So it's effectively a specular reflectance, the specular being a shiny area of light that bounces off. So at the angle of incident, where it hits that surface and where you're looking at it, causes it to be brighter or duller, depending on that angle. So look at rivers or mirrors. If you stand at a certain angle, it's far more reflective. If you stand up and it's higher, it's less reflective. So light penetrates these areas, and that's the microfacet area, and it bounces around. So if you think of metal's got a very tight atomic structure. So light hits it, it's very even, and it bounces straight back off it, very reflectance. And then you've got skin or wood, where it's not. It's very uneven, all over the place. Light will hit it, bounce everywhere, any which way. It'll interdiffuse, so bounce within itself, go into the surface and come back out. So you end up with soft light. That's why you see light scatter across the surface, or you see it bounce and bounce back up. In addition to that, there is also the factor of global illumination or radiance, but I won't get into that. That's effective. That's not really physically based material. It is, but it isn't, and I'll leave it for now as part of that. So effectively, there's two real layers they're emulating, which is the specular layer, i.e. the shininess of it, and the diffuse or subsurface layer, so how much the light goes under it and bounces across it. So it diffuses and disperses that light across the surface. Now, most textures and assets are artist driven, or at least they were prior to that kind of PBR coming in. So they had to create independent scenes, and then they had to light those scenes and the textures, otherwise the objects all looked exactly the same. So you could stand in an area and you'd have a diffuse map on a brick or a wall, and then an albedo map for the colour, and it ends up looking what you call flat, and I used to call that flat as well. So all those surfaces look the same. They're lit differently, as in the different colours, and they've got different textures within them, but in your head, whether you know nothing about lighting or not, you can see that they all look the same. But when you go to a PBR-based material, the shiny brick looks shinier, the duller areas look duller, so they don't reflect light as much, and where you're standing means that the angle of incident where light's hitting is either shinier or duller, dependent on what it would look like in the real world. So they're emulating those two areas, and that's consistently calculated at every frame all the time. So PBR is a drastic change in that, and it greatly reduces that process because it means that the artist doesn't have to keep hand altering every single area. They have a slider in most engines, which basically is just metal, high reflective, low metal, not reflective. And the engine, it's not a seismic change in terms of your head space to understand it, but it's a very strong mathematical and then shader area in terms of the engine then has to run multiple passes, or at least work out what light is doing, what shadow is doing, what surfaces that object has, and therefore what it would look like in this particular lighting instant from where the camera is looking. And that's what PBR is in an engine. So PBR based materials effectively emulate the surface qualities of each surface independently of what that surface is, and it's all based on the light in that scene. So probably not the best description, but hopefully that gives you an idea of what it means. There's a lot. It's a very complicated subject. Effectively, look at Ready at Dawn titles, look at The Last of Us Part 2 compared to The Last of Us Part 1. Not the remake, the original. Jesus, these titles. Hopefully that explained it. If not, I'll try and do a video on it, if that's what people would want. Okay, next question is from Hobex, and he asks, any ideas why shader and traversal stutter is suddenly such a big problem? Unreal Engine 4 seems to be part of it, but there were UE4 games before that didn't have the issue. Why is this suddenly a thing? All your distinguished competition can say is it's complicated. Again, I think it comes down to a couple of things I said in this particular video, but over the last few months. There's two areas. So Unreal Engine 4 supports DirectX 11. That's the first thing. So shader compilation stutter, which is one area of what you've just asked, is only related to DX12 and Vulkan. And that's because the state pipeline of DX11 is very different to what it is in DX12. And also the driver element from the manufacturers of the cards is different. So you end up with AMD and Nvidia doing more work in DX11 for you than you do in DX12, where it's on you. So long and short of it is time, stroke, skill of the team. It's very hard. That said, it's very complicated in the PC space because shaders are effectively small batches of code that run across an object, and they're spawned, so they're kicked off, instigated by something in the engine. And the problem with it is the shader stutters are related to the individual spec of your setup. So it's not just your GPU, it's also your GPU's driver and the operating system. If any of those things change at any point, you have to reset all of that. Effectively, the game has to create bytecode. So that's code that's at the binary level that your GPU will run. And that's based on the driver you've got on that GPU and the architecture of that GPU. So you can see the kind of spider's web of disaster that creates for a developer, because you've got, I've just covered it in this video, in fact. Look at the entire market of GPUs. Every single one of those, plus each of their individual drivers, has to have a unique shader compilation done, because it's different. So you can't create one for an RTX 4060 and run that exact same shader compilation on an RTX 4070. In theory, you probably could, because they're the same architecture, they're very similar in terms of processes, they're the same driver. If you've got the same driver, I know, either or, but that doesn't work that way. So you can't ship it with the product, or at least there's no easy way of doing it. There are solutions they're working on. So the biggest problem is it's the age-old situation of chicken and egg. One's got to come first. DX12, far more, because it's just more prevalent in the marketplace, but Vulkan as well, means that the developers have to do more work to get that working. When it comes to consoles, you don't get it, because consoles ship with fixed hardware, so the problem I've just said goes away, because effectively, in your Q&A pass, you can get somebody to play the game, this is the ideal situation, on the console, finish it, that builds up a complete index of every single shader that gets created during that play. That gets compiled, and when you install the game, it does that and builds a shader cache compilation. So it basically builds an index on your box to say, here's all the bytecode or the index to it when you need it, and it stops that stutter. The stutter is effectively your PC doing compilation at the very second mid-frame. You've just shot your gun and the guy's blowing up. The problem with it is just having a guy explode doesn't mean you've then got the shader, because if that guy explodes in a pool of water, that's a different shader pass than it would be if he blows up next to a bunch of boxes or he blows up in a room with grass, because There might be physics, there might be the reactions around him. So there's all those permutations that make that more complicated. So that's the problem. The complexity of it has moved to the developer's side, i.e. it's in the engine. And realistically, it brings me to another part of the problem, which is when you make everything very low entry, so Unreal Engine, Unity, all these engines everywhere, and everyone wants to be in games industry because it's this mythical beast that's magical. What wouldn't be a perfect job working in the game industry? Everyone goes into it. They maybe don't have the expertise, knowledge, and experience that people that did 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago did. So you're coming from a very different practice. And it's almost as if people have forgotten the fact that skills and experience is very important, specifically in a technical area and specifically in something as demanding as video games. So that's also a factor where smaller teams, less money, less skills, less experience could have more problems than bigger teams. Not saying bigger teams are exempt from it, but usually bigger teams are trying to ship a bigger game. They've got a deadline that's pushed on them and they just want to get it out the door. Respawn Entertainment and Jedi games. Terrible. Both of those games have had terrible launches performance-wise. Just so many hiccups in what I would class as unfinished state. And they have shader compilation issues. It's a good example. But there's many, many titles that have had it. It's a big problem. I'm not belittling it. It's a big problem. It's a huge amount of effort. It's not an easy one to fix. But that's what shader compilation is. So it's effectively all this complexity that's now been pushed over in the past couple of years to developers. They now have to fix it. And there's all this noise and work going on at the moment behind the scenes to try and work out a magical way of doing it. And Epic could try and do that in Unreal Engine 5. And if they do achieve a solution that allows people to build effectively, you want it. This is where AI should come in, really. If AI's got any benefit, somebody's going to write an AI pass that plays your game overnight and builds your entire compilation across every combination of hardware, and you emulate the hardware within, the software that you've got the game running on. All of that is viable in this sense. It might be locked behind, Nvidia probably lock it and say, we'll do it for you and then we'll add a fee. Probably that'll probably be an option again. But all these things can be fixed, but it takes time. And therefore, while it's taking time, we're all going to get the pain of it. The next one you've said is traversal stutter. So traversal stutter is effectively the impact of the current generation consoles. As I said at the start of the generation, it is effectively what happens when you take hardware that was baseline development around a PS4. So predominantly PS4 was the big ticket item last generation. So you're basing it around a 1.8 teraflop machine. It's got approximately 8 gigabytes of total video RAM. Around 5.5 gigabytes are available to the machine, to the game, the app. And then you've got a mechanical hard drive. No one really used the DVD drives in there, Blu-ray drives in there. So that was kind of relevant. So that really limits how mad you can go with the game. So you've got potentially 50, 100 megabytes read speed. You've got latency there that's incredibly bad because it could take you ages to get to the drive to the data, which is why games were bigger because they stuck them over on disk. I did a whole video on this. You go and check that out. I'll put the link down below. So all that's gone away because now developers are going, I don't need to worry about that. I've now got instant access, so no delay in terms of latency to get to data because I've got SSDs. There's your first hit straight away. If you don't have an SSD and a very good subsystem in your PC, it's going to affect you. You're going to get traversal stutter. You're going to get loading stutter. You're going to get access issues effectively. Data race conditions won't present themselves, but you are waiting for data to get something done. So that's the first thing you're going to get. And the second thing you're going to get is the fact that you've got limited VRAM and split pools of RAM. So again, we're just talking about PC space here. If you think about the PS5, I'm a developer. I'm making a game. I've got 13-ish gigabytes, 13.5 gigabytes of application space that I can use for my game. So I'm probably going to take 10 gigs of that for GPU space. I'm probably going to use another 3 gigs of that for data, storage space, sound, all that kind of stuff. But it's all there. I don't need to duplicate it. I don't need to copy it around. I don't need to move it. In addition to that, I've got an SSD speed that's got, 5.5 gigabytes of speed in terms of raw bandwidth, more compressed. That's great and it works, but they're not looking to fill that data all the time, every second. But what is important is they can, and the latency to get to the data is very quick. So what you end up with is a game that starts pushing that technology harder, and they say, actually, and this is what developers will do, so it's nothing new here. They'll go, here's here's 8 gig. I've used all 8 gig. Can I have more? Here's 10 gig. I've used all 10 gig. Can I have more? So it doesn't matter how much you give people, they're going to use more of it. So when they get to that point, they then start leaning on the functions that are in there. So the PS5 has all of this additional hardware, and this is why sometimes you see games with slightly more performance hiccups on Xbox than you do on PS5. And this will generally get worse, as I said before, as the generation goes on, because as the more demanding they get, the offloaded hardware the PS5 has to do all that work means the CPU and GPU is never stressed with doing work the PC has to do. So in the PC space, they don't have that hardware. That's the first problem. The second problem is they don't have the functionality to run the same software solutions that the consoles do. So things like Kraken are not viable on PC because not everyone can run it and decompress it the same way, so they can't use those Kraken compressions. You can use it, and there's games that will use it, but it's not as easy to do. But also, they have far heavier load on the OS and the APIs than they do in the consoles, specifically around the PS5. So what you end up with is all that decompression work, the copying, the moving of data across. The PS5 doesn't have to wait for that on its CPU and GPU. All that's done for it. So effectively, it can have stutter. It does have. It's not as if, these things aren't limitless. There will be issues within it. But fundamentally, the PS5 has a lot of that work offloaded. On PC, you've got heavier workloads from the OS itself, from the API. All of that overhead is on top of the actual system itself. And then you've got split pools of RAM. Then you've got to copy data into, from the hard drive over to RAM, over to VRAM. You've got to decompress it. All that gets put on the CPU. And they're still trying to get things working again back to the DX12 issues. And, it's a classic example of running before you can walk. All of these functions and features are out there, but they don't work fully. So direct storage, for example, is still only in the beta stage of having to have the option to decompress stuff within the GPU. Now, remember, this is another thing. When these things happen as well, just because you can then decompress data from the GPU doesn't mean that problem goes away. It means it comes off or reduces the pressure on the CPU, absolutely, but it could potentially add more pressure on the GPU, and then you can end up having smaller, admittedly, dips. But the GPU is not going to magically do that decompression without any impact on it if it's compute-based. So you're going to use LU time to decompress that data anyway, unless there's hardware in the GPUs, which new GPUs will have. Absolutely, it's going to happen. They're going to mirror what's happening on consoles. You're going to get dedicated hardware that allows that decompression to happen. But the API is not there yet. So all the traversal with big games where you're streaming data in really, really fast, and there's lots of things going on at once, and they're decompressing data, they're copying it across. All of that has that pressure on PC, which means you'll get stutter. And I'm talking like not 1 or 2 frames. It's where you get like 50, 60, 100 millisecond spikes, and it feels like a pause because that's effectively what it is. And you'll get those at certain points. And even big modern engines now, they have sector points. So they will effectively pick a point within a grid that will load data at a certain point. And when that does, they'll stream things in. That's why, if you looked at my Forspoken review, if you had the textures on high on a lot of PCs and then span the camera around, you can see that on that engine, they're doing that in the PS5. They're basically streaming textures in and out as they need to when the camera moves within the frustum. But on PC, that puts a massive overhead, and your average frame rate goes down. So you're getting these small stutters that just cause the overall performance to drop. If you lower the actual texture asset, the texture quality to a lower level, it mitigates it. It doesn't remove it, but it mitigates it because there's less data, less bandwidth needed, and all those things get reduced, and therefore you get better performance. And that's where they'll have to work on this on the PC space, and fundamentally you'll get new hardware in the end to fix it. So it might end up being, offloaded somewhere else. Like I say, likelihood is on the GPU. But that's what traversal stutter is. It's effectively taking data from one system, copying it in, instantiating it, decompressing it, and sticking it on screen. All of that has a cost, and the consoles are just better at it because of their unified pools of RAM and their dedicated hardware. And as we are now generally entering into the current generation quality of games, obviously we're going to see the assets and quality ramp up, which means you're going to get this more and more often, or at least it could get considerably worse before it gets considerably better. But we'll have to wait and see of the big games coming out later this year. Hopefully that answers that question. Thank you for it. It was good. Wow, so that's over an hour. That's the longest one I've ever done. Apologies. Hopefully that was beneficial. I have got a couple more questions, but I'm going to move them to the next one because I think this has gone on way too long. And I'm not going to spend much time editing it down because I just don't have the time here on a Tuesday night. So I'm going to render this out and then upload it, and then I'll get it up for patrons, and then it'll be up for everyone else at some point later on after that, which is obviously you'll see that if you're a patron, you'll see it sooner, and if you're not, you'll have seen it later. Hopefully it was beneficial, and remember, if you want to be a patron, support me. I'm completely independent, self-funded. Anything you do can and will help. Comments down below, share this video where appropriate, all that good stuff. Otherwise, I'll catch you guys and girls on the next one. Thank you very much.